and offering gratitude. We're so grateful to Well+Good for facilitating this event and for all the organizers who put their hard work into it. I'm personally so grateful for each and every one of the panelists who are here today, all of whom I have great respect for. Hi, ladies. I'm so excited to get into this conversation and to talk with all of you. And then I think I speak for all of us on this panel when I say that we are so grateful to all of the participants who are with us and who have joined. It is just an honor to share your time and your energy. And most of all, of course, we're thankful for our elders, for our ancestors, our leaders and our mentors in our respective Indigenous communities, those who have come before us to pave the way for our existence, our livelihoods, and who have shared with us the knowledge that we carry. Our ancestors have worked so hard to survive, to overcome hardships, to carry us in their wombs and in their hearts, and to selflessly pass on their teachings. And without them, we wouldn't have wellness, we wouldn't have health, and we wouldn't be here today. So again, we're just grateful for our ancestors and we look forward to passing these teachings on to our descendants as well. So I'll introduce myself a little bit more. My name is Chelsey Luger. I am the co-founder of Well for Culture, which is an Indigenous wellness initiative founded about 7 years ago by my husband, Thosh Collins, and I. I'm also a trainer for the Native Wellness Institute, which is the beneficiary of the funds that have been raised for this event today. So again, thank you to all who donated. The Native Wellness Institute is an amazing organization that has been doing healing and wellness work for probably longer than I've been alive. And so it's always an honor to represent them and to work with them. And I'm so glad that Well+Good had agreed with me that these funds should go toward their efforts. I grew up in North Dakota. I'm a member of the Turtle Mountain Band of Chippewa on my mom's side of the family, so I'm Anishinaabe. And I am from the Standing Rock and Cheyenne River Sioux tribes on my dad's side of the family. I currently live in Phoenix, Arizona with my husband Thosh, who is a member of the Salt River Autumn community. And our daughter Aloe, our 2-year-old, lives with us, and then we have another baby on the way currently in my belly. So I'm so passionate about all things Indigenous wellness, and it's just, again, an honor to host this conversation and to represent my family and community today. So before we go any further, I always like to start in a good way by using our breath. And so panelists, I'm going to ask you to join me. We're just going to do 4 deep breaths in through the nose, out through the mouth. And of course, everybody in the audience, I ask that you join as well. We can't see you, but you can see us. So we just like to unite with one heart and one mind. And I know that all of us share the intention for the continued healing and prospering of Indigenous peoples worldwide. That's our mission. And I think that we should all unite in that by using our breath. And so as we do our 4 breaths, I'd also like everybody to visualize the 4 different directions where all of the life-giving elements come from that, again, allow us to be here sharing space today. So in 3, 2, 1, we're going to breathe in through the nose and exhale. Second breath, inhale and exhale. Third breath, inhale and exhale. Fourth direction, inhale and let it go. All right. We always like to start our events that way by using our breath and uniting with intention. So I'd also like to continue by acknowledging that there are people all over the world joining this discussion. I want to give a major shout out to all of our Indigenous relatives from all over the world. You are invested in the health and well-being of yourselves and of your communities, which contributes to the evolution of Indigenous nationhood. And we very much salute your efforts. And for those of you who have a general interest in wellness, but might not know much about the Indigenous worldview, we welcome you with open arms. And this is a great place to start learning about our communities. Too often we are seen for our struggles before we are seen for our strengths. And our struggles do exist, yes, but that is not our complete story. The truth is that our communities are vibrant and full of life. We are diverse and dynamic. We are balanced and thriving. And hopefully the information that we give today will be a breath of fresh air, because in the wellness world that is so often based on passing trends, we represent ancestral knowledge, which is the opposite of trend. This is we understand an ancient worldview that has been passed down and is continually evolving and is rooted in intergenerational love. Again, I'm just so excited about this conversation. And the final point I'd like to make before we get into it is that it's hard to begin these conversations with both a widely Indigenous audience, and then also we're aware there's an audience that isn't as familiar with Indigenous culture or wellness. I was tempted to get into sort of teaching colonialism 101, but I don't think that we have the time for that today, and I certainly don't want to put that responsibility on the panelists. But I do want to acknowledge that the impacts of colonialism and institutionalized racism are very much relevant for any wellness practitioner who is operating today, whether you are Indigenous or not, whether you are a person of color or not. And so if you don't already have a very solid understanding of those things, but you are practicing wellness, I ask that you make it your intention to becoming very educated on those topics, because it is absolutely relevant and important. And I think that it would only enrich and enliven your wellness practice and your ability to teach as well. So yes, let's get into introductions of these badass matriarchs who are joining us today. Rather than myself reading sort of a dry bio of everybody, I asked everyone if they would introduce themselves. So I'm going to start with my friend, Jessica, if you would please introduce.
I better take myself off of mute. Yo gelaka stoklan lilakwala, nugo am putlas, nugo am anankwe, nugo am Jessica, gaikan la sahis lu wakeman sound, gaikan la gyukwan la Yalis, Gaikinlaha, Hatwamis, Lu Kwagil, Lu Nanglis. So I just wanted to share a few words in my language. As you can maybe tell, I'm a learner and on my early stages of reconnecting to our language, which is called Kwakwa. And in our way, as Kwakwakiwak, Kwakwa speaking people, we share that introduction of saying who we are, our given names, where we're from, with the lands that we come from. And typically the introduction's longer and gets into our family connections. So I would introduce you to my mother and my father and my grandparents on both sides, which helps to situate us, because that's how we are as Native people. We're very relational. So I'll also share that I'm a mother of two beautiful daughters, Maya Sequoia and Lila Starlight, and I'm a wife to my husband, Vincent Dunban. And we live in a small community in Canada, or what is currently known as British Columbia, Canada, on Vancouver Island, called Alert Bay, also what I referred to earlier as Yalis. So I'm calling you from our Numgase territory, and very grateful for this invitation to be speaking and sharing space with all of you wonderful women doing great work. So thank you, Chelsey, for that invitation. So on my maternal side, I mentioned we're Kwakwakiwak, and on my paternal side, I come from mixed ancestry, and my father is, well, he was a first generation American born in New York City from an Ashkenazi Jewish family. And so I carry those bloodlines of intergenerational resilience and strength, and I'm very proud to be stepping into that strength of recognizing those identities. And I just also wanted to state that it's been a really challenging week since last Tuesday. And just introducing my community, I shared Alert Bay. It's a small village of about 1,200 people. Half of that population is First Nations of mixed backgrounds, mostly Kwakwaka'wakw tribes. And last week we tragically lost a young person in an accident that happened on our traditional territory. And today his funeral is happening. So I have my candle lit and just being mindful of that huge loss. And I've been supporting on the ground here with the crisis response team. So just want to say I'm in a little bit of a raw state, still processing everything that's been happening and holding those emotions. And I wanted to state that because this is the reality of being in this work of Native wellness, of Indigenous health. It's hard work. It sometimes feels very hard. There's always a lot of different things happening, and grief is something that we have to work through. So all that to say is that the young person left a beautiful legacy for our nations to remember and give thanks for his life like that. And just briefly about some background on who I am and some of the work that I do. Currently, I work with the First Nations Health Authority, which is a unique health authority in Canada. It's the first of its kind in what's now known as British Columbia. And my title is called the Traditional Wellness Specialist, working with our Vancouver Island family groups, the Kwakwaka'wakw, the Nuu-chah-nulth, and the Coast Salish peoples. So for me, that's a really humbling position and role. I am tasked to work with our communities and our nations to support and develop a traditional wellness network, which is really uplifting and bringing together all the different traditional healers that we have across the Vancouver Island territories, and to support them and what their needs are in doing the important work that they do, and to help them with their mentorship of the people that they're guiding and working with. So that includes people who work with the medicines, who have those knowledge, who have the knowledge of the ceremonies, who are traditional language speakers and singers and elders, matriarchs, and it's a really wide breadth of really amazing people that I get to learn from and to be surrounded by. So for me, it's a great place to be in my life. And as well, I'm working on my doctoral studies. So I have a background in science, and my doctoral studies is titled Reconnecting Women, Reconnecting Through Women's Teachings, Language and Movement, Culturally Adapted Yoga for First Nations Women and Girls. So really this research is about connecting and combining all of the things that I'm passionate about, which is working with women and girls and two-spirit people and youth, and creating space to feel connected to our breath and to our bodies, and to connect with one another. So I'll share that much, and thank you again for having me.
Thank you so much, Jessica, and thank you for being here despite the incidents that are taking place in your community. I know that those things are always very challenging, and we've recently lost a few elders here as well that are near and dear to our hearts, and we've been coping with that. And but like you said, it really is the reality, and this is our day-to-day. And so again, it's just an honor to have you. Ashley, I was hoping you could introduce yourself next.
Anin Buju, Ashley Nindishnakas, Miskogami Zagaigan, and Donjeba, Migizian Dodem. Hello, everybody. I'm Ashley Thompson. I'm a member of the Red Lake Ojibwe and of the Eagle Clan. Currently, I live on Tono Athon lands and Pascua Yaqui lands in Tucson, Arizona, where I am a PhD candidate in anthropology at the University of Arizona. I've been in academia most of my adult life, so in 2014, I graduated from the University of Minnesota Morris with 4 bachelors of arts in anthropology, English, American Indian Studies, and multicultural studies. And then I got my master's in anthropology last year here in Tucson. My research is focused on Ojibwe food sovereignty, specifically with my community, the Red Lake Ojibwe, and women's roles in our food sovereignty work. I'm also a National Science Foundation Graduate Research Fellowship Program Fellow. Besides all of the nerdy stuff, I also am an athlete ambassador for Ultimate Direction and La Sportiva. My 2 primary movements are running and rock climbing. So I've been running on teams since high school, and then I ran for my Division III cross country and track teams in college. And then when I moved to Tucson, I picked up trail running and have actually been doing better now as a runner and setting personal records than I was in college, which really shocked me, but I really attribute that to focusing more on my wellness holistically. So for example, I've been alcohol-free for over 3 years and have learned a lot more about nutrition and our foodways and how to take care of myself more holistically. I've been teaching the last couple of years in American Indian Studies, and I've been teaching a 100-level course called Many Nations of Native America, and I think that's where my true passion lies. I really love working in education and bringing to the forefront Indigenous history and contemporary issues that I was never taught in my pre-college education. And so I find that that's probably where my passion lies. And I also write on social media personal essays around wellness, healing that I found through movement outdoors, through running, through climbing. I write on Indigenous issues and activism, and then like personal essays on you know, anything from wellness to sports to racism in the outdoors. I've done a lot of public presentations around justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion work in outdoor recreation. And so that's known as JEDI. So I've talked on an Indigenous perspective to rock climbing and outdoor recreation. I've also done academic presentations on my research in Indigenous and Ojibwe food sovereignty. And I just wanted to express my condolences to Jessica and your community. I know that a lot of us are facing a lot of loss with COVID and everything that's going on. And so just wanted to express my gratitude for you being here and for Chelsey for inviting me and all of the great panelists that are joining us.
All right, thank you so much, Ashley. That was awesome. And for viewers out there, as you hear these introductions, you know, I specifically asked each of these women to offer an extended introduction of themselves, because I just think it's amazing to hear about the intersectionality of everybody's work. And this is the true essence of Indigenous wellness. It is holistic, it is interconnected. Our ancestors were very brilliant, and our culture is very brilliant in breaking down these barriers and these walls between all of these different areas of health that are relevant. And so, you know, I'll also mention that Well+Good will be emailing a follow-up to all participants, so you can continue to follow everybody's work on social media. And so even though, you know, we only have another 40 minutes left here today, I think that these are women who you can learn from for a lifetime. So with that, Mariah, could you please introduce yourself?
Oki, nistu natanaku omach ke stowakaki, nopachtu tu sitsikitsi tapik sakum, nistu amskapipikani ki kainai, Ki Chalagi. Hi, everybody. My name is Mariah Gladstone. I introduced myself in Blackfeet. My name means Walking Raven Woman, and I am a current resident of the Blackfeet Nation here in the land known as Montana. I get to live along a beautiful lake, and that's where I'm beaming to you today from. I am Blackfeet. I am blood with relations up in Canada, and on my mother's side, I am Cherokee. So I am the founder of Indigikitchen, which is my primary focus. I work on the revitalization of Indigenous foodways and the restoration of our traditional nutrition, the foods that go with that, but also these other components that accompany that with plant foraging, with traditional hunting and care through these practices. So I teach a lot of that, but I use digital media to do so. So I'm sharing information through social media and video and Instagram and ways that we can engage with folks in the 21st century. So as a person that's also, like Jessica and Ashley, been very involved in academia. I have a degree in environmental engineering from Columbia University. Realized that that was not my main focus, and went back to school recently, and I'm currently finishing my master's degree in environmental science at SUNY ESF, based in Syracuse. Fortunately, I'm just now working on my thesis back home, and working on studying traditional Blackfeet land management techniques as they relate to some of our food plants, and how traditional harvesting practices and ecosystem management came into play in terms of the ways that they restore the plants that we traditionally relied upon, and how we can incorporate some of those things back into our diet now. So beyond that, I am also very active outside, always outside kayaking or hiking, and I'm an aerial teacher. So I teach pole fitness and I teach aerial silks, and I'm always out and about and up in the air. And again, thinking of wellness in a very complete form. So while I'm working on nutrition and I'm working on food sovereignty, also making sure that I'm practicing wellness in a physical and active and movement-based sense as well.
Awesome. So it's so funny, all of the connections. I didn't even realize that Mariah went to Columbia for undergrad. So I went to Columbia for grad school at Columbia Journalism School. And then another interesting connection that Jessica and I had connected on when we first met like a few years ago is, Jessica, I don't know if you remember this, but I was a personal trainer at Equinox Tribeca as like a side hustle when I was in grad school. And Jessica was also before me a personal trainer at Equinox Tribeca, and we never like crossed paths at that time, but we just thought it was the craziest coincidence that we knew some of the same people and, you know, had acquired personal trainer certifications from the same place. So it's just interesting, all these connections that we make, whether we're near or far from home. And speaking of connections, my Lakota sister, Jordan, I'm wondering if you would please introduce yourself next.
Lila Pilamayaye, Chelsey, for inviting me and being part of this amazing virtual conversation, and to Well+Good for this amazing collaboration to feature such inspiring voices. And my condolences to you, Jessica, for sharing your honesty and your vulnerability, and for the loss in your community. I know this is a really hard time, and I'm still like going through my grieving of losing my uncle a couple weeks ago. So my heart's with you and my prayers are with you and your community. Haumatakiapi, hello my relatives. My name is Jordan Marie Brings through White Horses Daniel. I am Lakota from my maternal side, and I am Dene from my paternal side. I am a citizen of Kuichasha Oyate, which is also known as the Lower Brule Sioux tribe, as it's federally known, in central South Dakota. I grew up on the res and near the res, across the river until I was 9, and surrounded by my relatives and my community, and that was the norm for me. And then at age 9, we moved all the way to the state of Maine, which was a complete culture shock. And that kind of really began my journey of, I guess, questioning my indigeneity and not being comfortable with who I was, because I was in a community that didn't accept me, where I experienced racism and was feeling like I was walking in two worlds as an Indigenous woman and as a person of color in a more civil, colonized society. And so it was a really hard road growing up and trying to fit in, but also trying to stay culturally rooted to who I was. And it wasn't until college that I really kind of reaffirmed my 8th grade dream, which was to move to DC to be an advocate for our people. Because for me, I identified DC as the place where laws are made, that advocacy happens there. And when things are being discussed about our people and our relatives, like, that's where change happens. And so that was my lifelong goal for so long. And that kind of just set me on the path of just wanting to be a good relative to our communities, and inspired me to become a blogger, to become an organizer when Standing Rock and the fight against No DAPL happened. And that's where I founded Rising Hearts, which is to help bring an increased visibility of Indigenous. And now as it's intersecting with Black and Brown and immigrant communities, I want to try and make sure that our voices and our faces are being seen on these platforms, and these connections are made, that compensation is happening, and that representation is there. And that's a lot of the work that I really try to focus on as well. My biggest part of my advocacy is really raising awareness and trying to be an advocate for missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, Two Spirits, and relatives, and for our communities, to talk about this long-standing historical violence and injustice happening since 1492. And I do a lot of other advocacy work on Change the Name, Not Your Mascot, a lot of conversations around JEDI, justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion, especially in the outdoor spaces and in corporate spaces now. I am a global run ambassador with Lululemon, where I also serve on the ambassador advisory board, which is helping to ensure that the corporate structure of Lululemon is doing the right thing and holding them accountable to their commitments in inclusivity, diversity, equity, and action idea. I am also an Ultimate Direction ambassador, so I'm happy to see and hear that Ashley is an ambassador athlete too. Running has been my whole life. I'm a 4th generation runner, and so it's in my family, it's in me, it's in my blood, and that's something I hope we get to discuss a little bit more later on in this panel. But I am also a rock climber. I am a mountaineer. I love hiking. I love stand-up paddleboard and kayaking, anything being out on the water. And something that as I've been on my own self-care and healing journey, I really have grown to appreciate yoga and that form of movement, being able to help me disconnect and connect back within myself when things are getting to become overwhelming and stressful, especially during the last several months, as so many of us have been voices and on these frontline fights happening today. But I'm also a producer. So. That's it.
That's it. That's awesome. Oh man, I just love hearing from everybody about all of the amazing things and projects that everybody is working on, and all of the really interesting directions that everybody is taking their academic work and their careers. And I'm going to jump right into with Jessica. I have a question for you that I was specifically asked by the organizers to ask, because a lot of people are curious out there. There is, on one hand, of course, we are proudly Indigenous, and I think that all of us recognize that there are so many ways that the world can and should learn from Indigenous culture. But where do we draw the line? There's also this issue of cultural appropriation. There's an issue of exploitation of our sacred medicines, of our ceremonies, that kind of thing. And it's a big topic in wellness right now. I know that I have read articles in the New York Times recently that address this issue. And so, Jessica, you do a lot of work with traditional healers, and you just have such a well-rounded perspective on these things. I wondered if you could offer a perspective on the use of sacred medicines by non-Native people.
Yeah, and it's a good question, especially since Chelsey gave a bit of a context to of who is part of this gathering, this virtual gathering. And I just wanted to say that I'm not any kind of authority on the topic. I can share some perspectives that I've learned, and really I want to bring it right back to the traditional teachings, and to not indigenize these teachings. There's unique ways of doing things that we each carry from each of our nations that we're from, but it typically, and you know, we do carry many things in common as Indigenous people, and that's really the worldview of respecting that knowing that the earth, we see it as our mother. And so keeping that in mind, how we treat our mother means everything. And when it comes to this topic, I'm just trying to gather my thoughts. And I actually brought a braid of sweetgrass to help keep me grounded during this talk, because I know that you had mentioned this topic before, Chelsey. But just bringing it back to the teachings is that we've really become misguided and misdirected from some of our original teachings. And really what it comes down to is that as humans, we feel that maybe we're superior to other aspects in creation, which is untrue. In our worldview, we see all things as being a part of creation, and we are not, we don't own nature. We're not, we don't own anything in this world really, other than our skin. And what we are to do here on this earth is to be of service. So keeping that in mind, some of the teachings that, what I've been taught in our ceremonies is that these medicines are for everyone. So the medicines don't discriminate if you're Native, if you're Lakota, or if you're Kwakwaka'wakw, or if you're non-Native and you come from, you know, an Italian background or whatever it is. These medicines are there, and they have not forgotten their original instructions. They know how to work with the people, but the ways that we know how to care for them is so important, and what's lost in this this matter of commodification and exploitation. One thing that I wanted to highlight, I know, Chelsey, you didn't want to get too far in depth with the sort of colonialism 101, but
no, please. I mean, if you want to, feel free. I just didn't want to put that responsibility on you if you didn't want it.
Well, I think one of the important things for people to be aware of is that in both Canada and the US, our nations were forbidden and outlawed to practice our ceremonies and our spirituality. And we're forbidden to use our medicines and to gather in our healing ways. And this was to ensure that we were more easily converted to Christianity. So it was along with many other harmful practices, all of this happened to really strip us from our teachings and from these sacred instructions. And just keeping that in mind, that happened for over 80 years. So if you think about that and put it in a context of how much disruption that would have across generations and how that ripples over. And so I know that in Canada, you know, it was called the potlatch ban, and it was only lifted in 1951. But really it took about 20 years until people were kind of able to come out and be public and to kind of remember these teachings and remember the ceremonies. And even then, many of it has been lost. Many of the teachings and real original ways have been lost. And as far as, you know, in the US, I believe it was around 1978. So these are still really pretty recent things that we're reclaiming, and it's sacred to us, and it's important to our connection to the earth and everything. So it's not something that we take lightly as, you know, picking up and selling if it doesn't belong to you, you know. So that's part of another teaching you have that we share, is that don't take what's not yours. Because when we do that, that's stealing. And that's something that's probably shared amongst most humans, that sort of understanding. But I think what I also was thinking of was that if we take this back and we look at it from a perspective and widen the scope, it's not just in the wellness industry that we can see where these things are fundamentally wrong. We can see this and we look at bottled water industry. And for us as Indigenous people, water is also medicine, and how that is changed when it's packaged, and the harmful effects that we see through that industry, through how it's impacting our communities. You know, the plastics and everything that's happening that are really harming, and also First Nations communities not having access to clean drinking water. That's happening across both, you know, all over Turtle Island. You can bring it to the pharmaceutical industry, all the extractive industries, everything, the forestry, you know, I could go on, the aquaculture. It's the mentality of that we are, as human beings, supreme, and that we can take from the earth and profit from it, and that treating the earth as a resource to be claimed and extracted. And so in plain language, it's just disconnection. So what I wanted to share from this is that the medicine is for everyone, but to be mindful and to be a conscious consumer and know, where does this come from? And you can ask that not just for your plant medicines, but, you know, I've seen a lot of like crystals and stones and gems being popularized in mainstream wellness. And you have to ask yourself, how were these sourced? Who benefits from these profits? And really bringing that social justice lens, and also ecological justice lens, because there's a lot of things happening, and huge efforts across around the world for people, especially Indigenous people, fighting for the protection of the land and the waters and our, you know, the air. That's our foundation for our life. So one last resource I just wanted to share. I love this book for those of you who are learning about plant medicines. It's Braiding Sweetgrass. And I also really recommend Robin Wall-Kimmerer. She has a TED Talk titled Reclaiming the Honorable Harvest. So I strongly recommend listening to that and understanding a little bit more context around the teachings of harvesting and understanding these medicines, to give you some more context. So.
Thank you so much, Jessica. I just couldn't agree more with everything that you said there. And, you know, I would also add that in addition to these practices being outright illegal, as you mentioned, until the 1950s in Canada, the 1970s in the United States, there has been a continued legacy of discrimination also, which Jordan touched on in her introduction of herself. And this has impacted all of us here on this panel, I'm quite certain. I remember so many times as a kid going to a mostly non-native school where I would be made fun of, whether it's because my dad had long hair, or I once had a teacher teaching about Native Americans, but he was white. And he described our most sacred ceremony, our Sundance, as grotesque. And so I had to get up in front of my class as, you know, a 13-year-old, and with a shaking voice and almost in tears try to explain to my classmates why that wasn't fair and it wasn't true. And so, I mean, I could go on and on, but I think that as Native people, when we have had to face the hardships that come along with trying to continue our culture and to support our communities and our families, and then we see others, like I saw an episode of Keeping Up with the Kardashians where they were like, waving sage around, like very disrespectfully and saying, get the F out of here, you effing bad spirits, and just like making fun of it almost. It's like we still face this discrimination and people don't take us seriously as human beings, and they don't take our spirituality seriously either. And that really is harmful for our children and for our future generations. And so, but I completely agree with you also, Jessica, that we don't own these medicines. And the medicines are of our Mother Earth. And I had a Sundance leader who would say, watch how you walk, you're walking on your mother. And I think that that's just good advice for all people to carry with, whether we're talking about the foods that we consume or all of the other ways that we live our life. So thank you. And then I'm just gonna really shift gears here. And Ashley, I want to ask you about the sport of climbing, because that is your sport, and you are making waves with Indigenous representation in the climbing and outdoor sports space. And it's interesting because I know that a lot of, well, first of all, of course, it has been a largely, white male dominated sport in many ways for a number of years. And I think that a lot of people get into these outdoor sports, particularly climbing, for the thrill of conquering a mountain or an obstacle. And there's very much that conquering mentality. And I would just love to hear your take on that perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it really ties in well to what Jessica was talking about. And so in the sport of climbing, I've been doing it since I moved to Tucson, so a little under 5 years. I've been a participant as a rock climber, and like Chelsey mentioned, it is dominated by mostly white people, and then historically mostly male. We're seeing more women in climbing, more diversity of genders as well as ethnicities, and that's good. But some of the legacies that started the sport, started by white males, have lived on. And so there is this mentality of conquering a mountain or conquering a route. And I too connect that to settler colonialism, which is something that Jessica mentioned. And so in American Indian Studies, this is like a core concept that we teach people, because it's crucial to understanding the state of Indigenous nations right now, especially on Turtle Island in the United States and Canada. And so there was classical colonialism, which is an ongoing process where colonists go to a foreign land to extract the resources to turn into wealth to distribute among the colonizing power. And then there's another type of colonialism, settler colonialism, where they do that same thing, but they send settlers over to establish permanent colonies, to extract resources, to redistribute the wealth to the colonizing power. And behind this process, which happened historically but is ongoing, impacts Indigenous nations today, she brought up this good point about, I think, sort of this mentality of, one, land ownership and owning resources such as mineral resources like oil, timber, land, and the land itself, which is, I don't want to pan-indigenize Indigenous nations either, but there are some commonalities among Indigenous epistemologies and ontologies of this idea that we are not owning the land, we are the land as Indigenous people. And so I feel like this conquering mentality, and I actually looked up that word because I was curious what the definition is, and it's to overcome and take a place by force. And so to me, that is definitely a core concept of settler colonialism, in which settlers invaded lands, often using military force and unscrupulous means, slave labor, genocide of Indigenous people, to accumulate wealth for themselves. And so in climbing, you see this mentality, especially historically, in which climbers feel that it is their right to climb wherever, whenever they want. And connecting back to Chelsey's comment about her ceremony of Sundance. So there's a Sundance ceremony that takes place at Bear Lodge Butte, also known as Devil's Tower, which is this very sacred place to over 20 Plains tribes. And in the 1990s, the National Park Service noticed more and more climbers climbing this amazing rock formation that just juts out of the plains. And because they noticed more and more climbers, they wanted to create a new management plan for this national monument. And they had input from the Indigenous nations of the area, from the outdoor recreationalists and the climbers. So they decided to issue a voluntary ban of climbing during the month of June when Sundance takes place, because Indigenous people were being disrupted by climbers. They could hear them, they were disrupting their ceremonies. And also climbing, it can be kind of invasive to the rock depending on the style. So there you can bolt climbs in which you put hardware into the rock, which if you view this as a sacred place, that might not be the respectful thing to do. And so even though it was a voluntary ban, a group of climbers still went ahead and sued the National Park Service for discriminating against them, which is just abhorrent if you think about what you guys just said about Indigenous people not having religious freedom in the United States until the American Indian Religious Freedom Act was passed in 1978. And so they didn't win the lawsuit, and that voluntary ban is still in place. But it really is a great example of the attitude reflected by the climbing community, that we don't care that you guys view this as a sacred place. We don't care that it's a voluntary ban. We're climbers. We want to conquer this on our own time, under our own terms. And so unfortunately, there's a lot of examples like that at Cave Creek, which is a Washoe sacred cave in Nevada. There is conflict between the Washoe people and climbers, and you see it on the Navajo Nation, where people are poaching climbs on Indianata, even though climbing apparently is outlawed there. And so currently, with the Black Lives Matter movement and all of these anti-race conversation and discussions that we're having right now, climbing in the outdoor industry has been roped in. And so currently we're battling racism in the climbing community, and not just those attitudes of conquering, but for example, there are a number of route names. When people establish a climbing route, they get the authority to name that route. And so we're seeing names that are really violent and racially driven. So I've come across names like Trail of Tears, where if you're an Indigenous person or you know United States history, you know that that was the forced march of the Cherokee, Choctaw, Chickasaw Creek, and Seminole nations, in which 4,000 to 5,000 Indigenous people perished when they were forcibly removed from their homelands and forced to Indian territory in what is now present-day Oklahoma. I've seen route names called, and I'm going to use a slur right now, Squaws in Heat. Jordan mentioned the missing and murdered Indigenous women epidemic that is haunting our communities right now. And so to further dehumanize us as Indigenous women, to using a term we use for other animals, as well as using a derogatory slur in that name, I think this is all just very reflective of the settler colonial mindset of having the right over the land, having the authority to expand westward, despite what anybody says, despite the sacredness of these areas to Indigenous people. I'm going to leave it at that. I could go on and on, but there's a lot of examples of this conquering mentality. Fortunately, there's being a lot of work done by Brown Girls Climb right now, local climbing organizations, to try to change offensive and violent route names and try to come up with a better system for us to climb more respectfully.
Mm-hmm. Wow. Thank you so much, Ashley. That is stunning to hear some of those, that racism that is continuing to take place, but it's people like you who are, you know, changing that. And so thank you. Jordan, or I'm sorry, Mariah, I wanted to ask you a question next. We know that the violent and abrupt removal of Native peoples from our food systems and our foodways has been one of the most devastating impacts of colonialism. And in my mind, it impacts not only Indigenous health, but the entire process of our original hunting and farming and gathering systems being pushed out and replaced with corporatized structures is harmful to everyone's health. And so that being said, I just would love to hear from you some examples of reclamation of our Indigenous foodways, perhaps some things that are taking place in the Blackfeet community where you come from.
Yeah, hi. Awesome to hear the different angles that I think we're all coming at this discussion from. I also want to shout out a second recommendation for the book that Jessica mentioned, because it's awesome and it's written by my graduate advisor. So Robin is wonderful. So I think as we talk about food sovereignty and this reclamation that we are having as Indigenous peoples to work on regaining some of the traditional foods that our ancestors ate. This, of course, comes with this much larger context. We've all incorporated a discussion of, you know, these aspects of settler colonialism that has led us to the point that we're at. You know, the statistics and the challenges that we're seeing in Indian country, whether it's through spiritual practices or outdoor recreation or food systems, are all very much through this lens that we have that comes through very intentional actions by colonial governments to separate Indigenous people from our various components of wellness. And so as we work to regain those things, it's important that we're not starting from this point and looking at what we're doing now, but also framing it within this entire context of why this needs to be done. And I think it's awesome that we're focusing on this positive, and we are looking at this upswing. We have hit rock bottom in terms of our lowest point in wellness, and our ancestors survived it, and they gave us the tools, and they passed those tools on to continue. And we are in this amazing generation of resistance and recovery. And so for food systems, I see all around me on my nation different things that are happening for the improvement of our connection to our local food systems. We are, for example, looking at the feasibility of building our own processing facility for our tribal bison herd to be able to process that meat on the reservation. Right now, of course, with a reservation of about 1.5 million acres, around the size of Delaware, we produce a lot of cattle, but also bison, both through our tribal herd as well as private herds. And without a processing facility, those animals need to be shipped away, sometimes out of state, in order to be butchered. And then that meat, that high quality meat raised in Blackfeet country, is then either sold elsewhere or shipped back to us at a premium. And the ability to write our own laws as sovereign nations that regulate the safety and the health of those facilities, but also the ability to write policy that can manage farming on our lands, manage the definition of organic on sovereign nations, is part of food sovereignty. So it's things that we're looking at. You look at the Indigenous Food and Agriculture Initiative, based at the University of Arkansas School of Law, long name, there we go, is actually working on model food and agricultural codes. So there are different code sections, basically pieces of policy or legislation that tribal governments can use as a template to adopt and into their own tribal government structures, and it becomes law on our various sovereign nations, depending on how those tribes work that. And so it's policy institutes that are working specifically on tribal food and agriculture code that makes up the components of food sovereignty. It's, you know, all these various things that are happening, and it's the support for our local producers, and it's the work that's being done to restore plant knowledge and foraging, not just for the identification, but the whole process of how you take your wild foods and turn them into dinner that's being done. And I think it's really, really cool to see. And it points to that ancestral knowledge that we're able to use as tools for our wellness today.
Awesome. And then just a fun, like, quick question, Mariah, what's your favorite Indigenous meal to cook and eat?
So I grew up and I was always a huge fan of lasagna. And so when I started working with Indigenous foods, I was like, wait, I can totally make lasagna using only things that were indigenous to North America. Yeah. And so my favorite food to make, also because it's delicious, is bison and butternut squash lasagna. Because tomatoes, butternut squash, and bison are all indigenous foods. If you want it to be really cheesy, you can do that, but it won't be indigenous after that. So
that sounds so good. Thank you so much for sharing that. And it looks like it's already 1 minute till time, but we're going to go over time a little bit by maybe about 10 minutes because I just want to make sure to get at least one question in with Jordan. Is everybody okay with that? Like, can all panelists stick around? If you have to go, I understand. Just like silently walk away. But Jordan, I want to ask you a question about, you know, well, thankfully in your introduction, you shared a lot about what you are doing with your Lululemon partnership and with your advocacy work and the interconnectedness of all of those things. So thank you for thoroughly explaining that already. I just find that so fascinating and awesome that we have an Indigenous voice, you know, representing in those spaces. But I want to kind of shift the question back, and I'm so curious to hear about the historical relationship between Indigenous communities and running, and how you were able to sort of realize that running is a way for advocacy to take place and to sort of catapult into this higher purpose. And just for the audience, I'll share that the first time I saw a photo of Jordan, I saw this distance runner with, you know, the number on her chest, and she has a red handprint painted across her face. It was a very powerful image. And Jordan, if you could just talk about MMIW and the spirituality of running and all of that.
Yeah, so as I mentioned before, like I'm a fourth generation runner, and it's in my blood, and it's something that connects me to my family. It connects me as I've been getting older. It connects me more to the lands and helps me to disconnect from work and everything that's kind of going on in my life to practice self-care and to continue my healing journey, and to feel close to my ancestors and my relatives. But one thing I want to note in terms of historical, you know, Indigenous running, like running isn't just about a fast time. I feel like when we talk about running and the running community, you think of the Olympic runner, you think of qualifying, you think of a personal standard or racing on a team or being part of a team, which is absolutely great. I loved being on a team in high school, and I ran D1 track and field and cross country. And it's a really great aspect in running community that's been supportive of me, but it's not about a fast time for so many people. And especially for our Indigenous relatives, it's about, as I mentioned before, it's about connecting to your surroundings. Historically, some of our Indigenous relatives were runners and ran for ceremony and ran as messengers. I know we had some the Pueblo Indian runners. We had Hopi messengers during the Pueblo Indian Revolt of 1680. One thing that I found really inspirational at the 2016 Boston Marathon was I got to meet Irma Chavez Cruz and what's his name? Arnolfo Quimar. They're Tarahumara, and they are long distance runners, and they run in their traditional they're called huarachas, which they're like their footwear, their sandals are made out of either like tires or raw hide, but they're like ultra runners, and they've been doing this historically and culturally for so long, and it's been part of their hunting traditions as well. They literally run their prey to death in terms of how they hunt. And we've had so many amazing historical runners in our lifetime. We have Lala Billy Mills, who is the only American and Native to win the 10K gold at the 1974 Olympics in Tokyo. We have Tarzan Brown, who is Narragansett Native and won the Boston Marathon twice in 1936 and 1939. And we have Tom Longboat of Onondaga Six Nations, who won the Boston Marathon in 1907. And we have Andrew Sock-Alexis of Penobscot Nation, who placed second at the Boston Marathon 2 different years. And more recently, last year, got to witness Maria del Carmen Tuncho. I'm not sure if I pronounced that right, but she is Guatemalan and Mayan descent. And she ran in her traditional clothing and huarachas at the LA Marathon last year. And she was running for equality and running for her family and the representation of women in these spaces. And so running is in our blood. Running has been generational, and it's our way to offer our prayers, to connect to the lands. But now, as we're seeing, running is a form of art. Running is a form of activism. And for me, that happened at the 2019 Boston Marathon, where it got to a certain point where I was fed up with feeling like Indigenous people are the only ones talking about the epidemic of missing and murdered Indigenous women and Two-Spirits and girls and our relatives. This wasn't getting the attention and support nationally by our government or anywhere else. And it felt like, as Anita Lucchesi said of Sovereign Bodies Institute, our relatives go missing 3 times: in the media, in the data, and in life. And it's so hard to get visibility and justice for the families and the advocates that have been in this work for so long. And so it got to a point where it felt like tweeting about it, writing about it, creating content about it, organizing panel events to talk about this issue in our communities feels like it's not enough. I'm going to turn this into an opportunity to just have it be focused on them. Run in prayer for our relatives, where I dedicated 26 prayers for 26 miles for 26 Indigenous women and girls. And I did that for all of the rest of 2019, over 106 prayers and 106 miles dedicated. And I am going to continue doing it until I feel like I don't need to anymore. And sadly, I don't know if that'll be in my lifetime, but this is something that I'm really dedicated to, because running is my passion, but my passion is also fighting for our relatives. And that was just kind of like the most meaningful and purposeful moment in my life, was creating this space for them, to honor them, to let them know that they're not forgotten, to let everyone know who's fighting in this movement for them. It's being seen, and I see them, and I want to support them and try to create more space and create more time for these discussions to happen, and to include this in the narrative as we're working towards rebuild and fighting for transformational change and dismantling white supremacy in these conversations.
Amazing. Thank you so much for the physical and emotional labor that goes into your work, Jordan. It definitely has impacted so many people, and we're behind you 100% as we see that continue. And I extend that same sentiment to Jessica, Ashley, Mariah. You're all doing great work, and I'm so grateful to know you. And I knew this was going to happen. We're out of time. And before I even got, through with half of the questions that I wanted to ask you, but maybe this is something that we can do again at some other point. And I won't take up too much more of your time and space today, but it's been an honor, and thank you all so much. Wopila.
Wopila, thank you. Thank you to everyone participating and viewing us. Miigwech.